Everyone, good morning. It's my great privilege to be here today, and that isn't guest speaker pablum. I really do mean it. I know the Marines in the audience in particular will understand me when I say I have mixed feelings about coming back to Quantico. Not all of them good, my memories, but my memories of this place, and I didn't go through Command and Staff. I went through, as you heard, School of Advanced Warfighting. My memories of this place are generally all good. So I am thrilled to be here today to talk to you, especially about this topic. And if at the end of this class you go to your seminar groups and you say, hey, this is really simple. It's just a question of I obey legal orders and I disobey illegal orders, and that's all there is to it. I have totally failed. Please don't put that if you're doing your course critiques, but that is, you know, if you really just at the end of this hour see this as a very binary question, then I would suggest you probably haven't looked closely enough at it. So last time I was here was 10 years ago. I graduated from the Marine Corps War College, and my graduating, or my thesis in order to graduate was entitled Dissent, Breaking Ranks, Dissent in the Military Professional. I think it's you know, it doesn't hurt my feelings. It's not on your primary reading list. It's on your supplemental reading list. And I wrote it, so in it, for those of you who did, I won't ask for a show of hands. For those of you who read it will know what I did in that essay is I basically said, military professional is not an ultimatum. That in that gap between receipt of order and execution, you have an obligation to exercise some degree of moral autonomy. And at times, that is going to obligate you to disobey orders. It may obligate you to disobey orders, even legal orders, because although all of us, and I don't, you know, I absolutely do not argue against this. All of us have an obligation to obey legal orders, but that isn't our only obligation. We have an obligation to the nation as embodied in our oath to the Constitution. We've got an obligation to our subordinates, which is implicit in the extraordinary authority that we have over them, and also, by the way, in a comparison of our oath as officers to the enlisted oath. And so you can't, in good conscience, run away from those obligations and simply default to obedience. That was the point I intended to make in that paper. It seemed to me at the time quite uncontroversial, and in any case, I just wanted to get the paper out and graduate. So the Marine Corps War College forwarded my paper to, it was the chairman's strategic essay competition. It didn't win. It was one of two runners-up. But more importantly, it went into the Joint Forces Quarterly in September of 2010, because I remember that date specifically because my life changed abruptly, and that is no exaggeration. So the paper, then an article, elicited what I can only describe as a storm of controversy, and most of it directed against me by pundits, academics, a few military officers, fortunately not many, who interpreted the article as being a wholesale attack on the principle of civilian control of the military. And meanwhile, I unsuspectingly had PCS to SOCUR in Stuttgart and decided the best thing to do was just hunker down. I was a little concerned at the time because the Colonel's Board was in session, and the publicity flying around was not necessarily good. I'll give you an example. So General Neller, who was then the president of the Marine Corps University, and this is what I'm told. I've never really had the moral courage to ask General Neller this question, but I was told he was questioned specifically about my paper in a HASC debate on a completely different issue. Thomas Ricks wrote in Foreign Policy magazine about my article, not in glowing terms, and suggested I should be asked to resign my commission. And that mantra was repeated in many articles, to include by Dr. Richard Cohen, not one of my greatest fans, who teaches or then taught history at the University of North Carolina. And it's just bear in mind, I'm absolutely not saying anything negative about these people, because I understand why they reacted the way they did. So Dr. Cohen, and I'm paraphrasing him, said actually my article should be a required reading for everyone in the military, so that it can be exposed as what it was, which is an attempt to unhinge the armed forces of the United States, which I found quite flattering. But I thought too that he'd missed my point totally. Because, and you're going to hear me refer back to this, because I wasn't saying that the decision to obey or disobey an order is up just to your personal wishes or dislikes or your convenience. I talk in there about a reference to professional ethics and competing obligations. And secondly, I didn't say then, and I don't say now, that anyone who does disobey orders therefore should escape the consequences. And that is why half of this class refers to moral courage. And maybe that is also why in the last 2 decades we have seen so few senior officers, and I can think of only one, but we've seen so few senior officers resign on questions of policy. So my point is that even if you, in principle, agree with a lot of things I'm talking about, there's nothing here that questions the principle of civilian control of the military. That is a bedrock of our democratic society, and I wouldn't for a moment attack that, or be even good order and discipline within the military, because all of you in this room, those of you wearing uniform, were given a commission for a reason, right? And implicit in that commission is the understanding that you will actually use your best judgment in deciding when to obey or not obey an order. However, so anyway, here we are, 10 years later, older, maybe a little bit wiser. If asked to, well, I have written again about the same topic, but looking back at that one paper, the theme, the logic train, I still stand by, but I would certainly change the introduction, because I told you that story about the resulting controversy, just to explain what a live wire this topic can be, and especially if it is wrapped into the whole question of civilian control of the military. So I would have changed my opening paragraph where I say that it has implications for civil-military relations. That may be true. What I should have said is for people's interpretation of civil-military relations. Okay. In any case, as I said, this is not an easy topic to teach, and then maybe that's why we don't approach it, for instance, at the basic school. There's no handy acronym that tells you when to disobey orders, for instance. Okay. I'd be very surprised if you recognize these two guys right off the bat, although some of you really are sad enough to read a lot of Prussian history will know that's the elder Moltke. But many of you probably have heard this story, could be apocryphal, doesn't really matter, that in 1866, during the very brief Austro-Prussian War, a Prussian major defended himself from reprimand by arguing that he was simply following orders. And I'm gonna mess this up and do something wrong here. I'm trying to use the pointer. Okay, anyway, the guy over here, Prince Frederick Charles of Prussia, who was this unfortunate major's commanding officer, then reportedly said to him, "His Majesty made you a major because he thought that you would know when to disobey orders." Now, whether or not that story is true, Moltke the Elder claims to have been there and told and retold that story when he was chief of staff of the Prussian general staff in order to explain what expectations he had of his officers. It's a wonderfully simple vignette, but the message that it conveys is anything but simple. Because you see, the defenders of the black and white theory of obedience have a pretty powerful argument. They can always say, hey, once you countenance disobeying an order or dissent, you let a very ugly genie out of the bottle. Because what's to give you the right to decide whether that order is worth obeying or not? How do you know that you have the big picture? That's why you have a hierarchy in the military. Because the higher you get, the bigger picture you know. So if you start telling people that at times they even have an obligation to disobey orders, then you're on a very slippery slope. And if you disobey orders, why can't your subordinates do the same? Well, in answer to that, and I've already discussed one point, is none of your readings suggest that the decision to disobey an order or to dissent should be based on personal wishes or dislikes, flighty emotion, fear, or anything but professional ethics, number one. Number two, I already talked about, none of your readings say that you should be able to avoid the consequences, hence moral courage. And the last piece is, which Moltke hit on, when we say that we use phrases that sound quite tired, like special trust and confidence and the value of a commission, this is what we mean, because you have to make decisions that are very hard. And we use cliches like life and death decisions, but that's exactly what this can be when you're trying to balance these obligations. I knew I'd screw this up, Brad. Oh, there we go. All right, agenda. And don't worry, guys, having sat in your position, I've got an eye on the clock, and I will finish in time for questions and to get you out to take a break and then on to your discussions. So I'm going to begin with the traditional view, and you're going to hear me say again that I have no argument with the traditional view. I only would challenge a very black and white interpretation of that view, and I'll explain why. I'm going to talk about the military as a profession. By the way, just show of hands, how many of you believe that you do belong, those of you in uniform believe you do belong to a profession? What's that?
There was a class.
Oh, there was a class? Okay, excellent. All right, good. Man, I'll just do away with that slide altogether. That's great news. Yeah, I was going to try and convince you that we do belong to a profession, but by show of hands, that's good. That makes my job a little bit easier. Okay, we cut down 5 minutes. All right, so anyway, given that we belong to the profession, I talk about professional ethics, which may seem like a squishy term, but it's part of the definition of the profession that every profession has a code of values and ethics. And again, I talk about the obligations, the competing obligations that those professional ethics impose on you. And then I single out one of those obligations for a little bit of a deeper discussion, obligation to subordinates. I talk about the difference in oaths, and I talk about extraordinary authority you have over your subordinates. I'm talking specifically enlisted subordinates. And I focus on this discussion because even if you disregard everything else, even if you say, hey, listen, I get it, I swear an oath to the Constitution, but that's kind of difficult to define what exactly that means. And I'm not sure I really understand all this stuff about being a professional ethics. Even if you discard all of that, there remains the fact that you do have an obligation to your subordinates. And if you simply default always to the mission, the mission and then the men or women, you aren't, I would suggest, thinking through the extent of that obligation. And then I hit upon something. It's kind of that's all the the why of dissent, and then I talk about the how. What does that actually mean? What is kind of the escalation of force from loyalty to what I call covert disobedience that you guys may better know as slow rolling, and what are the implications? What are the practical and ethical implications of each one of those methods? And I haven't forgotten, half this class is on moral courage, and I promised those who were kind enough to ask me to give this class, of course, I did the readings, and I will prove it by talking to you briefly about the readings at the end and pulling them into the whole argument. And this is where moral courage comes in. I leave it till the end because Jeffrey Scar, for instance, says that and I agree with him, that there has to be a worthy component of courage, right? Courage, there's something intrinsically wrong, for instance, if we say, hey, he was a brave terrorist, courage has to be displayed in service of a greater cause. And so in order to give meaning to that, first we have to talk about whether dissent, disobedience can ever be a worthy cause. All right. Traditional view that the military officer gives, to use that hackneyed expression, his best military advice to his civilian leaders, the President, NSC, Secretary of Defense, in a debate that should be forthright, but thereafter, once a decision is made, he has a choice. He either resigns or he simply executes. Okay, again, that's the bedrock of our democratic society. And again, I'm not arguing with that. It is, all officers have a duty to obey legal orders and obey legal orders and disobey illegal orders. And as I talked about, if the problem with espousing anything other than that, and I recognize this, is that you are on a slippery slope. That's at least what the traditionalists would say. But hold up for a moment. So even before we talk about squishy things like professional ethics, before we talk about loyalty to or obligation to subordinates, let's just look at the traditional view. The difference between legal and illegal orders is not always as apparent as people may think. You can probably think of examples yourself. Can anyone think of an example last decade? Oh, maybe it is pretty cut and dried then. Waterboarding. Yeah, enhanced interrogation. All right, so enhanced interrogation at the time, it wasn't clear whether it was legal or illegal, right? I mean, there were subsequent court cases, but at the time, it was not. Another example, the questions of military tribunals in Guantanamo Bay. And there were actually cases of military officers refusing to do certain things because they felt that it was illegal or at least immoral. So it's not always clearly apparent. And I tried to make this point when I wrote an article that I think is on your reading list, the War on the Rocks article. I received an email from another military officer, and it basically said, "Hey, this is really simple stuff. It's if it's legal or illegal. What really don't you understand about that?" And so I made these points, and he said, "Okay, then you have an obligation to disobey illegal or immoral orders." So already we're in that gray area. So anyway, enough said on this. My point is that absolutely. Even if you adhere to traditional view of obedience, there's still a gap for moral autonomy. And then we've got our own doctrine, at least the U.S. Army and the U.S. Marine Corps, our own doctrine of mission command. And I've got a quote up there, should be up there. Yep, General Milley, all right? So General Milley himself, well, first of all, mission command. So mission command, we've learned from the time we're lieutenants that you can disobey an order in order to achieve the higher purpose, right? So we already countenance disobedience on the basis of professional judgment. Why wouldn't we? Why would we then shut out disobedience on the basis of professional ethics? And it's interesting. In your readings too is an article by David Barno, and he's talking about General Milley's talk to the Atlantic Council a couple of years ago, and this made headlines because General Milley's talking about disobedience. He says, yes, absolutely, you're expected to disobey orders. Now, when I first read that, I thought, he's just talking about mission command. This is uncontroversial. And who knows, maybe that is just what he's talking about. But the problem is, he refers repeatedly to, and I can't get the pointer to work. It's my, yeah. Oh, it doesn't? Okay, all right. So anyway, he refers repeatedly to professional ethics. So he's already stepped outside the scope of pure mission command, which is just about, its mission accomplishment. And if you're referring to your professional ethics to decide whether to obey an order or not, that's beyond mission command. So my point is, it's just, even if you ignore everything else, it's not practical, and it's illogical. It doesn't adhere to our own doctrine to simply to default to obedience. That may seem like a trivial point, but none of this is trivial, all right? This isn't a comment on a political comment by any means. How long have we been in Afghanistan? 2 decades, right? Some would argue we've been there 2 decades with changing goals, not clearly defined goals, a steady drip attrition of blood and treasure, and not a single general officer, for instance, has resigned over it. And that's not because they're bad people, but maybe, as has been commented in recent articles, we don't do a good job of educating what your duty is in the whole play out of execution of policy. All right. So let's take a closer look at our profession. We take an oath to the Constitution. Everyone knows that, and that you hear a lot. Yes, my loyalty is to the Constitution, etc. Not any particular administration. But what does that actually mean? It's not always clear, right? I mean, the nation. There's an implicit in that is an obligation to the American people. But remember, even Supreme Court judges differ about interpretation of what the Constitution means. So again, this gets back to, this is by no means simple. So when I talk about what does it mean, I think it's fair to say that there is an element, as I said, of obligation to the nation, things to avoid disastrous consequences to the nation as an institution. There's also an obligation to the profession itself. And the best way that I can explain what I mean by that is to give you an example. Again, not a political comment. This was I think this was in your readings. We did the dangerous politicization of. Hey, bear with me. I have not been drinking. I was over at Colonel Gordon's house last night, and we drank purely water, and there are witnesses. Dangerous politicization of the military. Was that on your readings? Yes, no? Yeah. Okay, so in there, he talks, for instance, about the incident almost a year ago where someone or an order came from the White House to cover the the name of the USS John McCain. And someone wearing a uniform evidently obeyed the order before it was countermanded. And the article looks at this from a point of view of, hey, the military should not be dragged into these political squabbles. And I agree, but what really concerns me about that story is someone in uniform obeyed it. You know, someone thought that was okay. And Elliot Cohen wrote a great article in The Atlantic after this, focusing on, from that point of view, saying just by that one act that undermined profession, our profession itself. So that should concern all of us. You know, an example of something, again, that might seem trivial, but the consequences are anything but trivial. And then lastly, subordinates. And I've talked about that, and I'll get back to it. Okay. Some of you may know, I keep talking about profession, and I can keep this short because you've already had a class on this. Some of you may have heard of Dr. Corin. She has the Stockdale Chair at the Naval Warfare College. She teaches ethics, and she wrote, I thought, a really good article on whether the military belongs to a profession a few years ago, published in the Strategy Bridge, which is kind of a geeky online discussion of national security stuff. It's like a less punchy War on the Rocks. But her article was pretty good. And in it, she sums it up as a profession has a body of knowledge that they're expected to use for the public good, and on the basis of which they're afforded certain privileges and an obligation to self-regulate. And then she talks about that to be part of a profession, you generate your own ethical code, ethical values that are part of the identity of that profession. So I won't dwell on this too much. I read that and I thought, you know, it resonated with me at least, and hopefully it resonates with you as a pretty good description of our profession. We do have a body of professional ethics, and there is an element of things that we do are in the public good, or should be in the public good, and of course a body of knowledge. So, if you believe that we are professionals, then naturally it follows that there's got to be some element of moral autonomy between receipt of order and execution, because otherwise that makes nonsense of the view that we are a profession. And when do you execute that? It can't just be for a better outcome, I would argue, right? But certainly to avoid disastrous outcomes for any of those three things, you know, to the nation writ large, to the profession itself, or to subordinates. And again, this, you know, examples abound, right? But you don't necessarily have to be just talk about the nexus between the military and civilian world. That moral autonomy and those obligations apply to a second lieutenant and can have profound consequences, certainly when it comes to talking about obligation to subordinates. All of you, I don't know if any of you have read bear with me for a moment. What It's Like to Go to War. Anyone read that book? Okay, so not in at least one, right? So I tell you, you know, I just finished that book. It's pretty good. It's the Marines' memoir of Vietnam, Navy Cross winner. But there's a vignette in there that'll resonate, I think, probably to some of you in this audience, where he, as a lieutenant, you know, I'll remember his name in a moment. The author is in a company in Vietnam, and they're just on a hopeless traipse through the jungle with no real objective. They're convinced that their battalion commander has lost his mind and just directs them from hilltop to hilltop. And through steady attrition, booby traps, and illness, they're watching the company whittled down until eventually the XO just says, hey, we're going to stay put and call in false checkpoints. And you know, that's the only way that I can ensure that the guys we have left are going to survive, and they were all convinced that there was no longer really a mission. So it was no longer a question of balancing the mission against the men. All right, again, it's a small example, but one, that illustration of how these questions come into play even at the lowest level. And I'm sure that some of you in this audience have direct experience, similar experiences of the same sort of thing. And again, disobedience, but I think in a case where someone has weighed obligation, mission, and the men, and decided that if that mission is incoherent or is in pursuit of something just not worthwhile, he's decided in favor of his subordinates. And by the way, he suffered the consequences. So again, no one's arguing that it should be otherwise. All right, so keep referring to this. So duty to subordinates. From the time that we are lieutenants, we learn that as in command at whatever level, you are going to have to make decisions that result in hardship and worse to your subordinates. And we all accept that. In fact, just the fabric of military discipline, our ability to accomplish missions, requires that we understand that. It's a weighty responsibility, but if we run away from that, then we're simply worthless as officers. But we're also worthless, I think. Let me not use that term. We also should question our value as officers if by default we simply obey even when goals are unattainable and indecipherable, all right, at whatever level. And among all of you, there may not be, there may, I'm not going to ask for show of hands of anyone who's actually, had to make this decision. I've known really good officers make decisions like this and suffer for it, and examples abound. But it's always something foremost in your mind. Now, as you get higher in rank, as some of you, as all of you will get higher in rank, but as you get very high in rank and you approach that nexus between policy and military operations, that responsibility becomes weightier. But your obligation to subordinates does not go away. And one thing that struck me was reading an explanation from Lieutenant General Greg Newbold, who is, I think, he's the only general I can think of who's resigned in the last 2 decades on a question of principles over the Iraq War in 2003. And he didn't cite anything other than his obligation to subordinates, because our oaths are very different. And he comments on that. And as all of you know, or those of you in uniform know, enlisted personnel promise to obey the orders of all those placed over them, whereas we and officers don't. We just say, we have no reservations about taking the office, and we promise to execute it to the best of our abilities. That is a significant difference. We do not include obedience in our oath, but those under us do, which kind of places an implicit obligation on us to make sure we don't get them to do anything dumb. And again, injecting perhaps my opinion here, but it seems to me that's almost black and white. But again, it gets to, it gets back to the fact that none of this is very straightforward. And when officers forget that obligation, bad things happen. And so, and this is just one example. 2017 in the Pacific, 2 collisions within the space of months killed 17 sailors. Now, the proximate causes of those collisions were mistakes made by sailors aboard those ships. But the overarching cause was were a series of policies that had gone awry in 7th Fleet, or from the top down, actually from Headquarters Navy, that resulted in ships being undermanned, under-maintained, and crews being under-trained. But in the final instance, it was 2 skippers who took the decision to obey an order even when they knew their crews were not ready for the mission. It was those 2 decisions that resulted in these deaths, because all the subsequent mistakes that happened below them wouldn't have mattered a jot if they had not made those decisions. And in the aftermath, the Chief of Naval Operations made this comment: commanders make decisions, sailor execute, there are consequences. What he didn't ratchet down on, and their decision was to say, no, I'm not going to go to sea because my crew's not ready. All right, just one, and this is, I'm sure, not an isolated example. Well, one example again of striking that right balance. Okay, now we're on to the how, because it frustrated me going through not just the readings you guys have been given, but all the readings that I have done on this topic. When I got to the point of, well, how do you dissent? How do you disobey? What is the right way to do it? What are the implications? There was nothing. You know, there was a lot of confusion. Disobedience and dissent get conflated. Best military advice is the cliche that's thrown around. The belief that, yeah, you speak up, but then you execute, but then what does that mean? Do you own the consequences of what happens after that? What if you speak up and then 10 years later nothing's changed, they've just got worse? At what point do you make a stand? And so what I've tried to do here is kind of provide an escalation of force for discussion. All right, this isn't Milburn saying, hey, this is the way it should work. But on the left side of that escalation of force, on the top here, you've got absolute loyalty, right? You offer your best military advice, and if it's not followed, you just salute and you carry on. And in discussions or books such as The Fourth Star or Cobra, talking about or Fiasco by Tom Ricks, talking about the Iraq War, they talk about, for instance, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs Staff at the time, General Myers, who was very much a proponent of this and was quick to kind of lecture his fellow generals on this. His detractors, this isn't from me, his detractors, though, referred to him as the blue potted plant because he simply just obeyed without any real pushback. So that's kind of an extreme example. But when I say, at what cost and do you own the consequences? If you offer your best military advice and then you simply execute and it results in disaster not disaster, but it has adverse consequences, a protracted war that drags on at great cost, for instance. Do you own those consequences morally? Or is it just enough to say, hey man, I gave my best military advice, it wasn't taken, so that's too bad. All right? That's not a hypothetical question. It's, at what point then do you reattack and come back and say, hey, this was not a good decision. And then what do? You speak up and resign, but if you resign, you just get replaced. So you haven't really affected the outcome, and that brings up the question is, what matters morally? Is it the outcome, or is it your act? Have you absolved yourself simply by resigning? Or do you have an obligation after you resign to continue trying to change that outcome? Speaking up, Congress, the media. Very, very interesting. When I was going through my own little purgatory there at Socure in the aftermath of my article, and I got a message to go up and see Admiral Stavridis, and I was expecting the worst. And he, far from it, you know, he sent me down and said, hey, look, I'm tracking, he thought it was quite funny, I'm tracking everything that's going on. Don't worry, you know, I'm not going to end your career now. But you know, and he said, hey, listen, I enjoyed your essay. He said, honestly, I asked myself what I would do, and I think after resigning, I would speak up. I would go to Congress or the media because I believe the outcome's important, not just the act of dissent. So I thought that was quite interesting. And of course, there were no witnesses, so you're going to have to just believe me that he said that. But you've probably seen him. He's been on the media quite a lot since then. And I think I would guess Admiral McCraven's another example of another guy who would probably tell you that the outcome is important. But you know, when guys like that, Stavridis, and this isn't a comment on right or wrong either way, but when they do speak up, it creates controversy, right? You know, should former generals speak up? Should they not? And I think for me, a lot of it comes back to, well, what did they do at the time? Did they speak up before they retired, or before they resigned, when they had perhaps, you know, that the chance to fire the initial shots in escalation of force, or are they just doing so from the refuge of retirement? Okay, and then lastly, disobedience. So when you're at a lower rank, right? I mean, anything below kind of 4-star level, disobedience may be. Hey man, I got out as a colonel. Had something. Disobedience may be your only recourse, all right? Because threatening to resign, you know, is not going to carry a lot of weight, and a lot of times in those sort of situations, you don't really have the time to do that. But what kind of disobedience is acceptable? Blatant, hey sir, I'm not going to do that, which case you get replaced, and again, it gets back to outcome, right? Someone comes in and still execute. Or you embark on an alternate course of action. And this applies to the higher level too, right? Alternate course of action. Hey, I want you to, hey, listen, I want DOD to take out General whoever he is, legally justifiable order, but you think it'll lead your country into war, and so you launch you get with Cyber Command and you go ahead and plan a cyber attack against that same country because you think that the consequences won't be as disastrous. Hypothetical, right? So there's, you know, there is an alternate course of action, another method of disobedience, and here, most controversial, slow rolling, all right, covert. Most of you are familiar with that. Now, most people would look at that and say, that is absolutely not okay. You should have the kahunas to roger up and just say, hey, I'm not going to obey that, or find some alternate course of action, but it's not okay to just kind of troll along and pretend to be obeying, but actually not. Some of you may have read in recent articles, though, that there's claims that senior members, recent members of the administration have done exactly this. And maybe they would give a justification in terms of outcome. Maybe it's not quite as clear as it seems. Maybe it isn't always wrong. One, and again, this is, you know, I'm not going to get on too thin ice here, but it's kind of an interesting contrast, for instance, recently between, for instance, General McMaster and General Mattis. McMaster wrote Dereliction of Duty. Some of you may have read about the failure of the Joint Chiefs to challenge the Vietnam War. and then subsequently as National Security Advisor, had very clearly a perspective of, I will voice my best military advice, but then I will execute. On the other side of the coin, maybe other generals who said, hey, our loyalty is to the nation. We've got to avert disastrous consequences, and we will do our best to do so, whatever it takes, even if that means covert disobedience. All right, so not, again, these are dilemmas, but it's something perhaps that we need to spend more time thinking about before we're put in those positions. All right, the readings. Jeffrey Scar on courage. Is that right? Yep. So he starts off, he talks about the Aristotelian view of courage as being not necessarily, as not being linked to fear. In other words, most of us think that courage, our belief now is that courage is overcoming fear. That's kind of the way we look at it, right? And Aristotle says, no, if you're a truly worthy guy and you've trained yourself to be that good, then you no longer have to deal with fear, and that is really most commendable, all right? I couldn't really pull that into relevance here. I just thought it was interesting. But then he talks about moral and physical courage as being indistinguishable. I, for one, didn't agree with that because obviously that's up to all of you, but here's why I don't agree with it, and this is a topic for discussion. Because I've known plenty of people who have loads of physical courage, but lack moral courage. Moral courage does seem to be in shorter supply generally, among people generally, and even among military officers. Physical courage, because of all the things that we're just programmed for that. And most of all, we're afraid of appearing afraid. So we do what are ostensibly brave things. But moral courage, not so much. It's not as common, I would argue. So there is a distinction between the two. Courage requires a worthy component. Yeah, I agree with that. Courage it doesn't seem to make sense to talk about courage in pursuit of an unworthy or evil cause. The goal must be a better outcome. Okay, this dude Milburn. JFQ article, sound logic. All right, I think it's sound logic, but the wording, poor wording, and that's really what distracted people from, I think, from the message of the article. But frankly, there are plenty of people out there who are just willing to be distracted by any discussion of obedience. And then I wrote an article in War on the Rocks, just a few months ago, and I think it was good as far as it went, but it didn't have the discussion that I just went through about what does it mean, what should people do if I'm countenancing dissent or disobedience in practical terms. That escalation of force, knowing or thinking about it beforehand is all important. Mike Denny, intersection of profession and professional ethics, So I agree with everything that Mike Denny says. He talks, when he talks about motive, and he talks about the Kantian model, actions fill the outcome of your duty, and he makes repeated references to professional ethics, to ethical foundation of the nation and the military as a guide to action. But what I found disappointing is that all his examples really come back to kind of mission command type arguments, right? All of his examples are focused on better outcome in terms of winning the fight. And even at the end, he goes, then that's our ultimate goal, is decisively winning nations' battles, which may be true, but it's largely irrelevant to the whole question of of using ethics as a guide, because it seemed more that he was using ethics as a practical guide in action to achieve mission command type results. Does that make sense? So I'd like to have seen that expand to some, if you're going to refer to professional ethics, then let's pose ethical dilemmas rather than tactical dilemmas. And then Levine, or Levian, he pronounced it, the prescient dissenters. He contrasts the approach by General Myers and General Newbold. By the way, if I'm wrong, and there have been other generals in the last 2 decades, and I could be wrong, who have resigned on questions of principle, please, you can either tell me now or you come up and tell me afterwards, because I would love to include that in the brief. But anyway, he contrasts the approach by those two. General Myers, as I said, very, very much traditionalist. But and here's one part that I thought was really interesting. So towards the end, he said, how do we solve this problem of having not enough dissenters in the right places? And within the military, he talks about professional military education. And that may be part of it. And that would contribute, that would arm people with the ability to use moral courage in the right cause. And he also talks about intellect, and that's very interesting. Maybe intellect does play a role in this, because, and this, of course, everyone in the room is included within this. You all have obviously reached that level. But for some people who are just very simple-minded, it's this A, they probably shouldn't hold a commission. But B, this is very difficult to grasp. It does take a degree of intellect and education. And as I mentioned, we're catching, this is great that you're all being called at command and staff, but maybe there needs to be discussions of this topic earlier in careers, like for instance in the Marine Corps, in the basic school. And then Paolo Tripodi, Dr. Paolo Tripodi, objective versus subjective disobedience, really similar to, I think, to my argument about reference to professional ethics. Objective disobedience is when you disobey with reference to some external code of ethics, right? Subjective disobedience is when you don't do something because you don't want to do it. In the examples he uses, it seemed as though a particular act, an individual found a particular act abhorrent for whatever reason. He didn't personally feel like doing it, but he didn't have any problem with other people doing it. And again, relevance, yes, objective. We are talking about objective disobedience. And then, he comments in there, kind of different topic, but one that also I find fascinating, exponential influence of leadership on collective behavior. And that has been proven time and time again when you read, again, I'm getting a little bit off topic, but this is a forum for free thought. When you read about how good units descend into the kind of feral madness that results in atrocities, you can, every single time you can point at the leadership, because the guys within that unit generally are a cross-section of the military. From My Lai, his a great article written in the New York Times about that did an analysis on that platoon, above average IQ, had the platoon performed well during workups, etc. But then they got Lieutenant Kelly and Medina through to the killings in Mogadishu in 2006, 101st Airborne, same thing. Anyway, that part was off topic, but I'm sure you've got a class on atrocities too, right? Okay. What's that? All right, perfect timing. Okay. All right, everyone. And that is it, the conclusion. No surprises here. The key thing is, all I'm talking about is competing obligations other than obedience, using professional ethics as a guide. And you still have to face the consequences. That's why half this class is on moral courage. That top part there, That's just not, that's not me just making an empty assertion. That's intended to be a starting point for your discussions after this in your seminar groups.